All right, welcome to another H War author interview, and we're joined today by Ana-Lucia Araujo, who is a full professor at Howard University. She is from Brazil, and I think the unique one that I have not had before, she actually has a Wikipedia page devoted to her. Um, and if I got it correctly from your CV, you have three PhDs. You have a PhD in art history from the Université Laval, and you also have a
Mhm.
PhD in history from the University in Laval. And you got a social and historical anthropology doctorate from EHESS in Paris, in France. That is quite impressive, I have to say. Um,
It's
and
the second PhD indeed is a co-tutelle that you call. Then it's a joint PhD, but we have two diplomas. Then we receive a diploma in one discipline from École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and then another one from Canada. This is
wow,
why.
still impressive, still impressive. And you have published a large number of books, including Public Memory of Slavery, Shadow of the Slave Past, Reparations of Slavery and the Slave Trade, and the one we're talking today about, and the backgrounds of both of our pictures are filled with it, Slavery in the Age of Memory, which just came out this few weeks ago, actually, I think, at time of recording, I should add. So tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book. What drove the decision for it?
Mhm. Well, then as you mentioned, the previous books that I had a book of 2010, another one from 2014, I believe. Yes, that I have been dealing with the issue of visual culture of slavery and memory of slavery. Then I've been working on this for about almost 20 years, and I've been focusing on then trying to find connections between different contexts, how people in the past, in the present, they engage with the past of slavery. And I have been doing this more focusing on particular areas, then first in Brazil and West Africa. Then when I moved to the United States in 2008, I started including the United States in this work. But the decision to write this book, I was finishing that book on reparations. That is a short history of the demands for reparations for slavery. And it was exactly at that moment when we had first Black Lives Matter emerging, and at the same time those debates regarding the Confederate monuments. And it was at the point when that white supremacist in Charleston killed, then it was that massacre then in the Emmanuel Church in 2015. And from there, we are going to have many historians who started for the first time here in the United States more intervening on this debate about memory, which was a topic that indeed many historians were not necessarily interested, because historians, they are looking much more than to at written sources. With they are working with the traditional written archives, and the idea of the book was to inform these debates that were going on in the past, as I had that background, having worked then on discontested memories of slavery, for example, in Republic of Benin, which is in West Africa, and is a society that was deeply involved with the Atlantic slave trade, and where we find today then descendants of slave owners, descendants of slave traders, descendants of enslaved people who came back to that area from Brazil, then I was pretty much familiar, I would say, first with the concepts, but also with these debates taking place then in the field. And this is why I told myself it would be important to have a book that inform people who perhaps are not necessarily very familiar with these debates about the different modalities, what is memory, what is history, and the different modalities of memory as it relates to slavery. And in my opinion, and continues to be, at that point at least, there were many historians who, even historians, were then mixing up these two different kinds of discourses about the past. There are history and memory. And this is why the book wanted to, my idea was to intervene in this debate in a moment when people then in their daily lives were facing the issue of then taking down monuments, taking down the Confederate flag. And then when the book started progressing, of course, we are having these debates now, not only, of course, here in the United States, but I would say it's an issue that is global now.
Definitely. And as you say, memory is such a fascinating subject matter. And I'm teaching a lot in memory kind of, and it's so fascinating of how certain subject matters have so much written on it, and then others you just have nothing. And it's like trying to desperately find that one book. So it's really appreciated to get something on slavery. Now, I think it's a really interesting part that you raised there was kind of this trying to expand kind of the vantage points that we have. Mm-hmm. And one part that I kind of, when I was reading through your book, was how do I best phrase it? It's sort of like how your book is aging. And mm-hmm. you have like the beautiful story of the Colston statue in Bristol in your book. And mm-hmm. it sort of felt like, oh my God, she wrote this in 2019 mm-hmm. in December probably, and the book comes out and the statue has been removed. So it's like, how do you feel about this summer in particular, of how much has happened that you have in your book, but mm-hmm. that it's like, you said it would be nice if we have a conversation about it, and we actually removed the mm-hmm. statue. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I how can I say? I think that I am familiar with this kind of situation, because, and this is why a book of this kind cannot take 20 years to be written. We have, when you want to intervene as a historian in a debate that is going on in the present, you cannot take that long to write. Of course, I was not expecting, nobody could expect that you would have a pandemic, that this issue of the Confederate monuments would also have, how can I say, an echo elsewhere. But at the same time, the argument of the book is related to the fact that the ways that these monuments, they emerged either here or in Bristol or Liverpool or in London or in France, these realities, these contexts, they were connected, and the claims, the demands of Black citizens, especially then to take down these monuments or to remove or contextualize them, this has been happening elsewhere as well. Then one of what I am doing here in many ways is also the history of memory of slavery. Then is not only a book that is about memory of slavery, but about the history of this memory. Then Colston's story, we needed to know how it got there, the demands that have been there for almost then 30 years. And then the monument was removed. But again, the monument was removed, and it's not that. The monument is going to be, probably in that particular case, is going to go to a museum where this history is going to be preserved, then people will be able to go to the book and perhaps understand that that moment that we saw in June 2020 is not an isolated fact, is the result of a long process that ended up that way. But this was then people, activists and academics as well, were pushing for that for several years.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure when the statue goes into the museum, you'll get a lot of phone calls asking about what you had written about it, I hope, at least.
Yeah.
Let's turn to this at the start of the book. You have a really interesting section that I want to explore a little bit, because you divide memory into a couple of different categories, and in part I kind of want you, if you could just briefly take us through these different categories of memory and kind of explain what they are.
Yeah, then these categories are categories that especially sociologists, they have explored these categories. Then I start with collective memory, that is referenced by many historians, but one of the authors who worked on this concept is Maurice Halbach, who is a French sociologist indeed. And of course, many of these authors, when they are working on these concepts, they were not referring to slavery, but they created, then I would say, frameworks that help us to understand. Then I start with collective memory of slavery by emphasizing that it's a modality of memory that is a kind of discourse as that happens in the present and relates with the past. But in the case of collective memory, we need what we call transmission. Then we need living groups. In all cases, memory need living groups, people who are still among us. And in the case of collective memory, transmission is important. Then we have groups who transmitted through generations a memory that is not the addition of the memories of each individuals, but it is how the group represents the past to itself and to others. Now, in the case of collective memory, my point is that collective memory, of course, is transmitted and is plural. And as Halbach put in his work, it operates also through frameworks, and these frameworks, in the case of slavery, memory of slavery, include the family, include religion, of course, include social class, and so on. And in that particular chapter, then I look at the fact that we have a collective memory of slavery, but it is plural. It's not the same for those who are descendants of those who were enslaved. This memory is different from the memory of those who were slave owners or slave traders. Then this is what I bring a number of examples that for example, the case of Francisco Félix de Souza, who is then a slave merchant in Republic of Benin. This is a case that I worked in the past, not through that lens, but I explored that case and confront him with another slave. In his case, he was a slave trader, but I compare him to Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner, and then his white family and his black family that was then the family of enslaved people. And of course, that in this particular cases, these are families that have some kind of their stories are documented, then we can still have access to them. But this is pretty much to create this sort of grid that would allow other than people reading the book to go to study other cases and understand how collective memory operates. Then I move in the second chapter to cultural memory. which is a kind of memory that is ritualized and often associated with material heritage. Then memorials, for example, and monuments, they are associated, of course, to the idea of cultural memory. And then I show also, of course, how these different modalities, sometimes they are intertwined. I think that it allows us, by using these categories, to understand how complex these relations we have as groups and individuals with the past. In that particular chapter, then I look at to a particular kind of memorial that is ritualized, that are these walls of names, and also establish relations then with the Holocaust, which is something that we can talk about because much of these studies about memory that we have to this day are referred to the Holocaust and not to slavery. Then I moved in the third chapter to public memory of slavery. And this is a modality of memory that is politicized, again, carried by groups who occupy the public sphere and also the public space. And public space, I talk here about the physical space of squares, and then streets and so on, buildings. And I explored then how this public memory is always politicized, and that these groups, they are constantly fighting to make their views of the past prevail in the public space. Very often, these views, they materialize through monuments, which is a form, then it's a much more crystallized form of memory. Then I insist that monuments are not about history. They are politicized, they are constructed by groups who organize themselves to have these devices in view. And then I move, after that, then I have a chapter on official memory, which is the result of all this melting pot between groups and with different views. But at some point, these memories, they become official when either an institution that can be, I don't know, UNESCO, or can be the government, or can then either the federal government or the state government, then any of these institutions, when they embrace one then version of these memories, then memory becomes official. And here I explore especially how slavery entered then the museum. And I'm not looking at community museums or museums that represent groups that are more or less, that are not well organized, but I look at museums that are more state museums than, in the case, the National Museum of African American History and Culture here in Washington, D.C., Museum of Aquitaine in Bordeaux in France, also the Nantes History Museum also in France, and then the International Slavery Museum in the Liverpool in the UK. Then this is the moment when memory becomes official. Then finally, I have two other chapters that are not in these modalities of memory, but they are needed because we mixed up a lot. There is a lot of dialogues, you can say, between memory and public history. Public history being a particular field that comes from a discipline that deals with people who are professionals, but these professionals, they are always influenced by these discourses about memory and about by the memory of their groups, their societies, and so on. Then that chapter focuses on that. And finally, I conclude with a chapter that is pretty much open, which is the chapter on art and memory, by making the case that art perhaps is one of these modalities of memory that engages with a lot of complex elements that are much less binary than the other ones. then I don't know if it was too long or if it was satisfactory, but overall that you don't even need to read the book, just to take this and you can go from there.
Well, I would say still you should buy it because there's so many great stories that you have in there that we'll only be able to explore some of them in a little bit more in detail. But it that in part, I think that was the way you organize these different memories was one of the fascinating parts, because it's like, as a Civil War historian, I'm usually used to like, we're talking memory, but we never break into pieces of like, what type of memory are we actually talking about of these kind of public collective. And that was nice to see kind of the differentiation that we may need to embrace more
Mm-hmm.
within Civil War history too. Um, now I do want to go into a few of a few of the things that you have in the books and some of the stories that you tell, because again, there's so many wonderful stories that you found in there that it's just it's amazing where you found it all. And one of the ones that I want to start with is what you already mentioned, Benin. And you have this Brazilian who goes to Benin and becomes a slave trader there. And I seem to remember the Washington Post, I want to say 3 years ago, ran an
Mm-hmm.
article talking about the legacies of slavery in Benin, of how some leadership in the state is still kind of tied to the slave traders. And also that Smithsonian Institute was trying to contemplate like museums related to slavery and the slave trade. So um, can you can you talk a little about whether this has actually moved forward? How is the memory landscape in Benin evolved?
Mm-hmm. I would say that the issue of memory of slavery in Benin is much richer, and these debates have been there, I would say, earlier before than in many places, including many places here in the United States. Um, I did the field work, then more extensive field work in Benin in 2005, and this was already almost a decade later when then the debates started earlier before in the 1990s. Then UNESCO, for example, that I am a member of this International Scientific Committee of the Slave Route Project of UNESCO, and that project was unveiled in Ouidah, that is in Republic of Benin. Ouidah was the second largest slave trading port. Then during the era of the Atlantic slave trade, we have Luanda in Angola, that was the first that exported the largest number of enslaved Africans to the Americas. But then you have Ouidah, that is there, that city that is still exists. That has a rich heritage that from that period. But the country then, there was always a consciousness of this slave trading past. Benin was then the power, then all different European powers were present there in Ouidah, with even forts, for example, the Portuguese, the French, the British, the English. I think that if I am not mistaken, even the Danish had a fort there, but the Portuguese were, and the Brazilians, they were they had a strong presence in that area. But at the end of the 19th century, when the slave trade was already ended, those who colonized that part of West Africa were the French. Then we find there individuals who were indeed the descendants of slave merchants who settled there in the 18th century. And we also have there then descendants of enslaved people who returned from Brazil to that area and who settled there. In this community, they formed a single community, then with descendants of enslaved merchants, descendants of enslaved people, and then we had, of course, the descendants of the royal family of Dahomey, who were then who also enslaved people, then who waged war against the neighboring states and groups and sold them into slavery to the Americas. Then there is a consciousness that in that society, there are people who are descendants of slave merchants and descendants of enslaved people, descendants also of the royal family. And in the early 1990s, there was debates, public debates about that. In the newspapers, for example, that there was a debate about who we are. For example, all the discussion on reparations that I became interested came from these debates that I would read in their newspapers there in Benin. And this idea that how we deal with that in a society where we have indeed people who are descendants of victims and descendants of perpetrators, and more than that, we had descendants of enslaved people who, once they settled back there, they became slave merchants themselves. Then it shows how all this is complex. But they started indeed in Benin doing this, memorializing this past associated with slavery and the Atlantic slave trade in the early 1990s by building monuments. They built an entire road with different stations that has memorials and monuments. Of course, now it's in a state of decay. There is a door of no return. After they added just nearby a door of return. Then there was a monument of the Catholic Church that was added just next to that, even if the Catholic Church fully supported the Atlantic slave trade. In any case, they know that about that past. And of course, you have statues honoring the slave merchant and so on. And when that journalist, he went to Benin, it was, I think, during a Vodun festival that they have there in February. He contacted me to ask about Benin and so on. I think that I am quoted in his article, but he was pretty much transporting the views from here, there, and say, oh, but here you are grasping, then you are grasping with this past, with the Confederate monuments. They are not doing that there, which is not really true. But you asked about the Smithsonian, but I will come back because it's becoming too long.
Well, that was just fascinating too, of kind of like and that's again something that we oftentimes overlook, right? How long-standing these conversations that we snapshot in a moment in a newspaper article maybe have been going on.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. Hey, and they have, and these issues have been there even in museums. Then there is a museum. There is the museum where the royal palaces are. It's a museum that exists since the 1930s, and that is a museum of the royal family and the kings who enslaved people in that area. They have those bas-reliefs with depicting these wars when people were captured and so on. There are also a number of other objects that tell the story associated with the slave trade. Then this exists there since the 1930s during the colonial period. Then we have another museum that is the Museum of Ouida that now is being renewed. They are totally renovating the fort where the Portuguese fort was. And there was an exhibition there that it is pretty much dated, but now they are, when the new fort will be ready, then the fort will be renovated. There will be a new exhibition there that then they are reconceiving the exhibition. In addition, they have all these monuments, and all the idea of talking about the slavery there was to attract tourists to the country. Of course, then tourists, of course, who have money to pay, then you are going to see much more, for example, American tourists going there than the Brazilians. And the Smithsonian, I think, that has been engaging in these conversations, but they have been doing their own stuff for a while. Then I think that the Smithsonian can provide expertise, then advice, but they have been doing their work for a while. Then I am looking forward to seeing what will be the result of all of this.
Right. That's, I think, the most fascinating part of the constant changing nature of the subject matter.
Mhm.
Um, let's go to the U.S. because Benin is sort of juxtaposed in the chapter with Thomas Jefferson, and I do want to talk a bit about Jefferson because we do have these two different stories of him as the kind of president, Declaration of Independence writer, but then there's the other story of him, the slave owner, the um, father of slave children, and kind of his own kind of the African American family in addition to his white family. And when I was reading through your chapter, I remembered back a few years ago, there was a story of, I want to say it was around Thanksgiving, of an African American family visiting the plantation on which their ancestors had been enslaved, and the family owning the plantation, their descendants were still owning it. It was this kind of almost jubilant get together, and then you kind of read in the byline of like, yeah, and whoever the ancestor on the male side was impregnated the slave, and that's the descendants that we see here on the plantation. And it's like, it was this very jubilant storytelling of kind of the reconciliation. And usually when I bring it up in class, I'm sort of also saying, well, why aren't we talking that the woman had no ability to say no in this, and effectively what
Mhm.
we're celebrating here is a rape. What um, how does that
Mhm.
play into the conversations that we have or not have at plantations where, like in Jefferson's case, we have offsprings of the planter who are slaves eventually?
Yes, and this has been a discussion, of course, that when I examine the case of Jefferson, of course, that I am not Jeffersonian, I am not a historian of Thomas Jefferson or of the American Revolution, but I am using him as a case that, as any other, then at the same way that I can study memory of the Francisco Felix de Souza in Benin, Jefferson is one of these figures that we can, that you should be able to study as any other figure. And the problem is that, of course, in the United States, first he's a founding father, then perhaps today less untouchable than has been over the last years. Today in November 2020, much less than perhaps 5 years ago. But there is all this discussion about then we as historians, we cannot know what was going on between him and Sally Hemings. We do not know her views about her association with him.
Mhm.
But the reality is that in that family we have then his father-in-law, who was then already the father of Sally. Then there is a how can I say, a pattern of
Mhm.
having then this having children and sexual relations with these enslaved women.
Mhm.
There is an entire discussion about race, then that this justification that it was possible because she was almost white and she was so beautiful that she was almost white. And even in that discourse there is this idea, yes, he was having sex with an enslaved woman, but she didn't even look like one because she was almost white. And the difference is also one of the elements that I try to touch. I don't know if I was successful in the book, is this idea that and this is a discussion that we had on social media. And I remember one journalist in a famous newspaper who almost wrote that that Sally was his sort of wife. That historians agreed that it was the case. Now, she was an enslaved woman owned by him, whatever was the nature of this relationship. Legally, she was an enslaved woman who died. We do not know where she's buried. She didn't inherit any property, and even his enslaved children. He freed two. The other two who were allowed to live, they didn't inherit anything. And if they were allowed to live, it was because they changed their identities and passed as white individuals, and this in a period when there were individuals who would legally free their children. Now, the point that I try to make in the book is also this idea that Jefferson is always presented as a sort of a monogamous man that had his wife, the official one, who died, and then he found another wife that was enslaved, and because she was enslaved, but that it was in the in the context of a monogamous relationship, and it doesn't seem very clear that that could be the case. There were plenty of enslaved women in that plantation, and this is an element that is never addressed, whether or not he was having then sex, and in the case having sex is not even the good word, then in the terms of today it would be raping then other enslaved women. And one of the issues that for the collective memory is important is that that plantation had not only the Hemingses that were associated by blood with him, but there were 300 people living there as enslaved people. And the memories that these individuals were enslaved by him and who were not the Hemingses could be different as well. But I think that when we study that, what we see is that much, even historians, local historians, archivists, and so on, they played an important role to not allow this story to come out. And it is with the work by Annette Gordon Reed that this story reemerged, but is still all this issue of the big question continues to be, what is the nature of a relationship between a slave owner who owns an enslaved woman? Can we, in this context, have talk about a sort of romantic then
or even
as some people
consensual.
suggest, exactly, consensual relationship, because many of the debate has been about, for example, the term mistress, which has that has been enslaved mistress or slave mistress. Is still being a mistress is a status that you choose to be or not, which could not be her case.
Yeah, and I think the other challenge that you have with the Jefferson story, it's not just that this happens and that we finally start with kind of scholarship to look at it, but it's also that we have Monticello with that kind of the grounds, the plantation of Jefferson, where a lot of people go and they want to, quote unquote, learn about Thomas Jefferson, but certain stories are just not properly being explored on those grounds.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. There was, I would say that, and it's hard when you are writing a book about that, because of course that during the period, during the research, I visit the places, I talked with curators, with the docents who are doing the work. We see also in conferences that people, there are a number of public historians, of course, who have been doing important work to make that story visible there. Now, the problem is, of course, that that is a shrine to Jefferson that has been there since the 18th century. It was built for him. The place is to commemorate him. And the introduction of the main element that was at the heart of that place, that was slavery, is disturbing for the average visitor who are then white families. You see a number of African Americans these days visiting the place, but it's not, you are not going to see many African Americans who are like that, can't wait to go to Monticello. Then this is still a place where people, they go to hear about him. And there are efforts, but of course, in terms of if you analyze this from the point of view of memory, we can see the number of places where there are silences, where there are gaps, where there are stories that are sort of repetitions that we see elsewhere as well, in other plantations.
Right, and that's a great lead over to other plantations, because I do want to spend a little time on Mount Vernon, because you do have a few items in it, and it's the irony actually of it that before COVID, whenever that perception-wise is, but earlier this year you made a tweet that Christine Coleman actually retweeted of Mount Vernon selling a certain magnet. I'll maybe put a picture on the screen for it. It's Washington's teeth. And I actually brought that to class, that tweet and that picture, and was like, we were talking about Mount Vernon, Washington at the time. I was like, why would you want to sell this? And I think they stopped selling it, right?
Yes, they removed the teeth. I would say that perhaps 2 days after the tweet, because what happened is I live in Virginia, then I live in Arlington, and indeed then Mount Vernon is about then it's 20 minutes. Then I drive. I am at Mount Vernon. Then I went there a number of times. I did then the research, sometimes just to visit, and then at that point I had to submit the final manuscript with the photographs, and I needed a photograph of the entrance of the museum. Where the exhibition and we have the wall of names for chapter 2, and this was near Christmas, and indeed the picture that is in the book is weird because there are the Christmas trees, but it's part of that. But then I went there, and then I always go to and I advise anybody who is doing this kind of research, never miss the shop. Because the gift shop is the place to go, because there are a lot of stories that are being told in the museum and then in the grounds and the docents, and the real story sometimes is being told in the gift shop. Then I was seeing that, and I saw that it's a sort of curiosity. It's this idea of selling things that are curious and perhaps funny, which is then in theory it would be funny to sell the teeth. The problem is that the teeth included and the teeth of enslaved people, we do not know if from the plantation, but we know that the teeth of enslaved people were used to make that kind of denture, and then the tweet had an impact and circulated, and they ended up removing. The power of social media and public history and memory.
Yeah, well, you accomplished a great deed there. Or stole great magnets from the refrigerators.
Exactly. Yeah, then I just regret that I didn't get one as to have a record of that, but I have the picture. But I had after that a colleague, then Cameron Monroe at University of California, Santa Cruz, that he is an archaeologist, and he contacted Mount Vernon in order to see in terms of the archaeology what could be done, because they have that set of that denture. They have the magnet is a reproduction, but they have and apparently there is something that can be done with that regarding, then I don't know what happened with that. But it was not just something negative. I think that there are interesting things that you can do with that
Yeah.
than selling it as a souvenir.
Yes. And Mount Vernon just has so many, you have so many beautiful stories about slaveries there. And the one I wanted to get a little bit more into was the slave cemetery, because
Mhm.
as you mentioned, I've been there myself. I think on 2 occasions. It's sort of like you come down from the house, you go to Washington's grave, and you go back to the house. And the slave
Mhm.
cemetery is sort of like hidden away in the clump of trees. There's not really good signage leading you to it, so it's this really overlooked and forgotten item, which is pretty common, as you state, for slave
Mhm.
cemeteries. And obviously, we're all going to agree that the first marker is just terrible that's put on grounds. And I do
Mhm.
want to get you a little bit more on the second marker that they put up, because I think you mentioned that it's an improvement. It's not really great yet,
Mhm.
but it's also sort of like when you think about the word choice, they're still saying that the slaves served at Mount Vernon.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so maybe in terms of how could Mount Vernon do better, especially with its slave past?
Yes, it's a question that I asked myself. What is interesting in those grounds is that and this is another, how can I say, another reminder that even in that place where Washington lived and the enslaved people lived, that place changes.
Hmm.
Um, and is still changing. Then the first marker that was put there, and the cemetery was really like, how can I say, the element that launched demands of African Americans
Hmm.
who wanted to have slavery memorialized there. And this occurs then, the first marker is there, I think, now I don't recall exactly the date, but it's
I
in
think
the
it's
early 20s.
1920s.
Yeah, 1920s, then early 20th century. And the vocabulary used is, we refer to then the stone, what is engraved is the servants.
Hmm.
Then we don't use the word slave or enslaved. This enslaved is something that we are using now.
Hmm.
And then that eventually that memorial is constructed. This was a memorial that students from Howard University, the School of Architecture, did. Um, the memorial itself is very simple. Then we don't have any figurative element. I think that is a place where people, they can perhaps meditate and so on. But overall, for those of us who did the experience of going there, you can you can easily skip the cemetery. There are plaques now showing clearly, but people is just not far from the Washington's tomb. Then people, they will go to the tomb and will not go there. Now, what happens is that in specific periods of the year, especially for example Black History Month, when you decide to take the slavery tour, which is still a segregated tour, as Stephen Small uses this term when he studied the plantations, because you can choose to go
Hmm.
see slavery, but you can decide to not do that. Then how that place could be improved, I think that the way to improve, if there is any way to improve, first, I think that we should not be naive. That was a plantation based on slavery, where atrocities were committed, that was built on the idea of white supremacy. That is not going to change. It's a site that for Black people from the United States or elsewhere, it's a site of pain and trauma and so on. Now, for descendants of the families who were enslaved there, we know that there were people there who were either descendants of people who were enslaved there, who served as guides. They embraced that place as
Hmm.
a sort of home. despite the tragedy that was behind that. Now, one of the ways I would say would be to incorporate slavery as the core element of the place. Then a person who is visiting that place, for example, you cannot go to to a site where a genocide was committed, where or for example, to visit a Nazi camp, for example, to see just the architecture, to see just the garden that is there, and ignore what was the main function of the place. And in that sense, when we go, for example, visiting the mansion that is the most popular element of that place, slavery should be at the heart. Everything that was being done, people who were cleaning, cooking, doing everything
Right.
in the mansion were enslaved people. Then I think that whereas this element is not fully incorporated, whereas you can have the choice of not seeing slavery when you go to a place like this, or whereas you have the choice of seeing slavery as something that was more or less benevolent, that, oh, they look, people here, do have these reenactors and they look happy to be here, they are telling us stories about George Washington and so on. I think that this should not be the, how can I say, the most important element. It remains to this day.
Yeah. Well, actually, let me get your opinion on this because, as I said before, I do teach Mount Vernon in class often, and when I talk about it, I always am like, to highlight that segregated aspect that you mentioned, that it's not just the tours, but I feel also the grounds, that when you come out of the entrance area, this kind of large new pavilions they built, they purposefully lead you to the right, lead you to the front of the house, and you go up to the house through the greenery, and then you kind of like maybe go to the left or the right once you're done with the house, to the tomb or kind of the blacksmith shop. But it's sort of like the back of the orangery where the slave housing is. It's sort of like you almost have to search for that slave resident, not to mention that the other half of that building is turned into a gift shop these days. It seems like it's not just the tours, it's also the grounds that are very much segregated and kind of still on some level to hide the institution of slavery.
Yes, and that place is interesting also because when it was then renovated and reconstructed, those slave quarters, there was already at that time a controversy. Of course, that you were referring to a plantation with then dozens and dozens of enslaved people. They didn't leave all of them in that slave quarters. There were the best ones. There were many who lived in the fields. That view of the fields is something that we do not have when we go to, because the idea when you go to visit a plantation today, what we see sometimes are some slave cabins.
Right.
But the reality of those places at that time, when there were hundreds of people working those places, would be many of those cabins. Then you are never able to visualize that when you go, and it happens there as well. When you visit the mansion, for example, then there is nothing referring to enslaved people. Then when you get to the kitchen, that is outside, this is when we talk about that. Also, the problem that happens in that tour and in other tours is, of course, if I am there, I will ask a question. And sometimes we do, of course, just to provoke. But if you don't ask, perhaps nothing is going to be said about this. Then it's something that is very complicated to mention. And I mentioned that when we were discussing in the book club last week, that Monticello said that they would I don't know what is the phase that the tour of the mansion, that they would finish that they would either reformulate, or the tour as it existed would no longer exist. But I don't think that is still the case, because Monticello at this point, I think that they are closed. Mount Vernon is open during now. They are open since the reopening. Then I went there a few weeks ago. They are still having visits to the mansion and so on, but it's still under the same terms. Then and now you can even take pictures of the inside of the mansion and so on. Perhaps they have plans to introduce slavery there in the mansion as well, but overall the reality is what you are referring to. Then it's still hidden.
Which is very sad. Let's see. Let's move a little bit overseas for the next part, because one of the beauties of your book is that breadth of geographies that you have, so that it's not just kind of the United States that we're used to when we talk about slavery. You're really forcing, especially American historians, out of the country, outside their comfort zones. And we already talked about Bristol earlier, but you also mentioned Liverpool and the International Slavery Museums there, which I had a chance to visit a long time ago, probably way longer ago than you did. And in part, I'm kind of out of personal interest curious, have they done updates over the years? Has this exhibits that they have inside evolved over the years? Or is this sort of like, it was done, it's static, and it remains so? And on the other hand, also kind of thinking about what did you find was the most impressive aspect of the International Slavery Museum? What stood out the most to you?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's say that the museum then emerges as a result from a gallery that was opened in the 1990s, that it was a gallery of the Merseyside Maritime Museum at some point on the eve of the bicentennial of the British abolition of the slave trade in 2007. There were these discussions, and of course, coming from the pressure of activist groups, Black citizens in general, academics, to have a permanent museum dedicated to slavery. It was a nice and interesting initiative because they wanted an international slavery museum, not only a museum that would focus on Britain. And I think that at the museum, I would say that probably is not very different from what you saw when you went there. And by the way, if you go to their website, they have you can enter and visit the museum. They have you can have a virtual visit of the museum and see the galleries, pretty much in detail, which is great, especially now with COVID. But I would say that one of the elements that, and I don't talk about this in the book, which is there is a certain dimension of the experience, appeal to the emotions, especially there is a sort of film that they have in a circular gallery that reproducing the Middle Passage. I think that it was interesting because instead of having that figurative representation of the Middle Passage, that is usually then reconstructing a slave ship and put their mannequins then representing enslaved people. They have that place that is dark, that we can hear the sounds, and having this sense of being in a closed space. Also, I think that the dimension of the legacies of slavery that they emphasize much. But one of the most interesting elements that is being done now in the International Slavery Museum, they are not the only one to do that. Then the museum is not the only one to do, but is the introduction of, they have been doing that for a while, that is the artworks. They have art exhibitions engaging with the topic of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. And they have a new curator not then one of the curators of now is Francois Manisson. I think that his name, that he came from Martinique. And when I was there for the last time, then before finishing the book that I included in the book, there was an interesting exhibition about then the abolition of slavery, and with several interesting artists that I referred, especially in the final chapter of the book. Then this, I think, that is an element that is engaging dimension that they were able to add. The museum is small; it's just one floor. They try to expand, were not able to. They purchased a second building in that dock, but they were not able to develop yet something there. But then the museum is packed, is small and is packed. Then they need expansion. That exhibition has limits, but it's also from the point of view of those of us who study this, is interesting because it shows us a moment when we started doing exhibitions about slavery, and of course this is going to change in a number of years. We see already with the museum here in DC that when this museum was inaugurated, and only the exhibition Slavery and Freedom, I think that is several times the size of the International Slavery Museum.
Yeah. And in part, I kind of was thinking as you were talking, it's interesting because I've seen recently a couple of articles of Confederate memorialization in Liverpool. Of, I think there's a statue or something of a marker, and it's sort of it almost seems that Liverpool is sort of torn between its different histories of being that base where Confederates built or privateers. You have the slave trade. How do we remember it? I think you mentioned street names that are being talked about too. Is there sort of a public engagement in the city where they're trying to work as a city through this past, or is it more of a certain groups that are trying to influence?
I would say that it has, the city has been under pressure since the late 1980s to engage with this past. Then the museum is the result of that. Members of the Black community, they organized tours, then slavery tours, to allow people in the city and from the outside to then to know the sites that are associated with slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. But of course, there are problems. And we are going to have, depending on the period, then we are going to have Lord Mayors that are Black British and so on, who will try to engage, like in Bristol. Then depending on the period, there is more engagement. But I would say that the biggest achievement in terms of this public acknowledgement is the museum, then unveiled in 2007. And there is the Walk of Remembrance that happens every August. There is then an entire week, indeed, that we have activities, conferences, performances, and it ends with this walk that gathers then academics, activists, and so on, and members of the Black community, their allies, and so on, that we walk through the downtown area, and this ends up in front of the museum, where there is a ceremony, libation, and so on. Then in many ways, this is a way of expanding the presence of the museum in the city. But there are problems as well, which is a number of sites where the docks were, churches, streets, that perhaps some locals, they know what the links with the Atlantic slave trade, but there are no markers. And we do not see any monument, any marker, any memorial. in this, I would say that is an element that is problematic. For example, the streets that are named after slave merchants or that are associated with the history of the slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, we know about that, of course. If you take a tour that is a specialized tour, if you read perhaps a booklet on the internet, or if you go to the museum, because the museum has a display with indicating that those streets are associated with the wealth generated by the Atlantic slave trade, then this is still problematic. For example, the city hall also, that most of those mayors that were involved with the Atlantic slave trade, you can visit the place, and there is a particular time in the year when you have those open days that you can enter there and you can have a tea, you can visit the place, and you see those portraits everywhere, and nothing indicates that those men were associated with the Atlantic slave trade.
Yeah. A lot of work still left there.
Yeah.
For sure. And let's go across the channel to the French, because that was, I mean, I knew about Liverpool, I knew about Bristol, but France I wasn't much aware of. So that was really fascinating too, to kind of get a little bit of the French perspective. And you have Nantes and Bordeaux as the two locations where museums did embrace. And you had like, I think, one or two pictures from the inside, and it looked like these, the displays, the exhibits were very modern looking, very kind of innovative in their design. So in part, I'm kind of like curious if you could talk a little bit about, first of all, the story, but also kind of the way it is displayed in these museums with regard to slavery and the slave trade.
Well, let's see. If we start with Nantes, that is perhaps the city that it was the largest slave trading port in France. Nantes really has been engaging in this debate since the 1990s, again, academics, Black citizens, and so on. And there is this castle that is a Nantes History Museum, and this is a huge, imposing building that has been there, then of course for centuries. And this is the Nantes History Museum that gathers the collections of previous museums also that that now don't exist anymore. And that museum that was involved in debates associated with the Atlantic slave trade since the 1990s, when they held an exhibition that was called Shackles of Memory, Les Anneaux de la Mémoire. And then the museum started then revising the exhibitions, and they chose an interesting approach, which is having then the exhibition follows, the museum follows chronological order than the history of the city. And we until the moment that arrives then at the 18th century, when the city is engaging then fully in the Atlantic slave trade, then it's much associated with the maritime history of the city. But of course, they have restrictions because we have the castle, then we have they organize the exhibitions by following the rules that they had. In many of the rooms where they associated with the Atlantic slave trade, they have this sort of look inside with wooden walls that evoke the slave ship. But they did an interesting job because they have all these collections that belonged to slave merchants in the city. Then we have these luxurious objects, then a lot of silver, a lot of china, tapestries, artworks, and also maps and documents and all these things, because they have an interesting collection of documents as well. And it started adding also artworks, because they have temporary exhibitions in a separate building, and when they have those exhibitions, they introduce artworks, then sometimes smaller versions of those artworks to interact with the old objects. Then it's a beautiful space. It's difficult to visit because I would say that it's very long. Sometimes the slavery inside is lost because it's too long. Then you have several sequences that you can choose to visit. But I would say that it's then that is an impressive museum, and I would say that the fact that their collections are very rich collections from the point of view of slave merchants and the slave owners.
Right.
Then it's all the instruments of punishment and so on that they have there.
And in part, I think what interested, or what I found interesting as well, was that and this may be something we can in more general terms talk about too, that France does have a pretty significant problem with racism. I mean, when you go to Paris, and there's certain neighborhoods that are very ethnically cohesive, and certain parts, I mean, northern France or northern Paris that had the breakout of violence over racial issues. And in part, I think that's interesting that France is trying to work through that past with slavery and the slave trade. How much is kind of that history and France's modern situation influencing each other? Is this seen as sort of a dialogue that we can use to improve racial questions in the country, or is this sort of seen as, well, it happened in the past and it's history?
I would say that there are several levels, but I would say that this work has that there is this debate in France for a while. Then since the 1990s, France in 2001 passed the law Taubira. There is a law recognizing slavery and the Atlantic slave trade as crimes against humanity. But there is still, of course, a lot of resistance from. Then there are two sides. On the one hand, there was a sort of official memory of slavery. There is pretty much established. Then a national day, May 10, that is a holiday with ceremonies, which we do not have in the United States. But the problem, of course, when you make memory official is that you crystallize that around that date and around those issues. And for certain politicians and so on, perhaps it becomes an excuse to say that we no longer have this problem here. First, because even the term race was something that was in official documents, something that could not be used in France. I remember that a first article that I published, I think, I don't know when it was, that then almost 20 years ago. And I worked on these French travel accounts in Brazil that represented enslaved people. And it was in French because my studies were in French at the PhD level. And I used the term race, and I was told by one of the reviewers that that term was not used there in France, that this was something, I don't know, from the United States or Canada or so on. In any case, then this is the problem. Then I would say that when memories becomes official, then there are perhaps less channels to have these debates, because the debate needs to pass through the official channel. Now, for example, France there was a national committee for the memory of the slave with intellectuals, academics, activists, and so on. And now there is a national foundation for the memory of the slavery, and there are plans to have a memorial in Paris, because most of these, there have been debates for very long. Then I think that the best book that covers this in terms of the associations and the groups debating this is the book by Crystal Fleming, Resurrecting Slavery, that was published about 3 years ago by Temple University Press. She focused a lot on Paris, but Paris has these debates and these associations of different Black groups then associated with Africa, who claim an identity associated with the Caribbean, but who are all French, but no memorial, no museum addressing the issue of slavery, and not big exhibitions either. Now, these exhibitions took place in Nantes, in Bordeaux. There were the ports. There is this idea that the story is connected to the ports, but Paris was somewhat a separate entity. And I think that this will change, and it's already changing. But it's always a game that there are pushes, there are periods when things evolved in other directions. But these debates have been there with Black activists, with academics pushing as well. Also with the dialogue with the diaspora, then in Africa and in the United States as well. This contributes, of course, like when you are on social media, for example, I see my colleagues who work on Asian history, that there are always debates with French journalists and French academics who have pretty much this image of France as disconnected from the slavery and from the history of the Asian Revolution, and they are daily pushing that. Then this is something I would say that it's a question of time that we are going to have more and more of these debates, and this recognition will have to occur. Now, racism and white supremacy are not going to change because there will be a couple of monuments or then a couple of dates commemorating this issue.
And that sort of is the big issue, and that always reminds me of Mitch Landers' statement when New Orleans removed the Confederate monument. He kind of nicely said that this is not the end. So this is sort of the start of a conversation that we need to have with regard to white supremacy, racism, the monument landscape in the country. And
exactly.
Yeah. Now, one kind of question that I kind of wanted to also consider is that you have Brazil, obviously it's native ground for you. You have Africa, which is kind of a very important connection. We have France, Britain, we have the United States. But I was curious about the other parts of Latin America. What about Spain? Does Spain do anything with regard to the commemoration of slavery, the slave trade? I mean, considering they are the first ones bringing slaves to the Americas, it's like would be like, duh, you should do something. Venezuela, Peru, Cuba. What do we have in that part? It kind of I was curious because it wasn't in the book. Maybe I'm suggesting in the next book to you here.
Yeah, I had in a previous book of 2014, I had a chapter that dealt with these monuments celebrating slave rebels, and many of them, they are in the Caribbean. And I would say that the British Caribbean and especially then, and also Cuba, these are places where there has been commemoration associated with slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. Then in Cuba with the revolution of 1959, when the symbol of the slave rebel is associated then with the spirit of the revolution. Then in a number of the monuments were unveiled. There are, of course, plantations that became museums as well. We have that in the Dutch Caribbean. And in particular in the British Caribbean, there are these monuments celebrating slave rebels. Then the British Caribbean and in Venezuela and in Mexico as well. That celebrated the rebels, and in the British Caribbean it's associated with the movements of independence. Again, it's a second liberation than the end of the slavery, with the rebels being the symbols, which is not the case here in the United States. Then here in the United States, then as far as I remember, the only rebel that we have is Denmark Vessel. That is a monument that was
Mhm.
unveiled in Charleston just a few years ago. Then there is this commemoration, there are holidays, there are festivals, I would say, in the Caribbean. In Latin America, Venezuela also is a place where this tradition, where all this commemoration became more accentuated when Hugo Chavez came to power, with then monuments to rebels as well. But I don't know what is happening in Venezuela now. Then imagine that under of course, that populations of African descent were empowered over these last 2 decades. But I believe that in terms of the landscape of commemoration, it's not strong because of all the economic crisis. I don't know what is happening in Peru. I know, for example, that in places such as Argentina, there has been debates. Argentina, a place that many people don't think about, is slavery associated with Argentina, but not with monuments, but much more in terms of debates regarding this history, then the conferences, then Black groups organizing themselves to then to tell the history of this. Of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. And then we have, in the case of Portugal and Spain, the most interesting cases, perhaps, then this no longer in Latin America, but in the Iberian Peninsula, which is, there are associated, first, Portugal as the one that is started in the Atlantic slave trade, going to Africa, the Spanish bringing to the Americas, and Portugal after, along with Brazil being the nation that then imported the largest number of enslaved Africans, then almost 5 million. Now, Spain is interesting because there is a monument, and I think that this is in the book. There is a monument that was of a slave trader, which was removed then about 2 years ago. Then this is an interesting, then it was part of all that wave then that we see in Britain, in South Africa, regarding roads must fall. Then it was by that time, I'm not saying that it was associated, but it was by that time that the monument was removed. Now, when a monument is removed that way, we can always ask if this is not, it is not in terms of acknowledging this past, but rather to get rid of this past in that particular case. In Portugal, it's interesting because there were several debates and interventions this summer with the existing monuments, especially one of the Jesuit priest that was unveiled just a few years ago. But Portugal is slowly recognizing this past. 5 years ago, it was not the case. They discovered now a cemetery in Lagos that was a first, one of the first sites where enslaved people from Africa were brought then to the Iberian Peninsula. Then there we had an auction, and there was a cemetery that is not a cemetery, the name, it was a sort of it was a sort of trash where people were, the bodies were disposed. And this was discovered a few years ago. They didn't do anything with that, but they unveiled a museum that is where this marking, then where the slave market was. And in Lisbon, as a result of the activity of activists then organized around associations, there is a memorial that is going to be in Lisbon, not in a hidden place, not in a distant neighborhood. It's going to be then along then facing the river. And this is a memorial that there was a contest. It's going to be financed by the city. And the population voted for the design of the memorial, and the population voted to give, how can I say, to have a budget for that particular memorial. But of course, as everywhere, this is one of the forces in play, but I would say that there is progress being made that wasn't there 5 years ago.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Do you kind of, since we're getting along here, I just wanted to talk briefly about teaching because, as you mentioned at the start, you maybe it was before I started recording. Um, it's one of those days. So let's talk a little bit about teaching. And in part, before we kind of start the interview, you mentioned that you envisioned this as kind of a book that students could read, that you could assign in class. But beyond that, obviously, most of us don't have the ability to go to the places that you mentioned. What kind of, how would you, if we couldn't assign your book to class, what kind of methodologies, what kind of ways would you envision could we bring the material from your book into the classroom?
Well, I believe so. I believe that my idea with the book, then I think that the different, then the concepts that are developed in each chapter could be useful to study other cases. Then on the one hand, to teach using the book, it would be possible, for example, to visit virtually the International Slavery Museum, to see objects that we have in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, to see images of the monuments that you talk about, for example. Then Monticello is possible to visit virtually, Mount Vernon as well, and let's say the Colston, who is no longer there. Unfortunately, Colston is no longer there, but we have so many pictures of that monument and video as well now. Then at the various stages of his death and resurrection. Then these could be materials that could be used. But now, the alternative way is to go to take the city where you are, that certainly has a monument or a site or an exhibition or a plaque that is associated with the history of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, and use these devices as taking into account perhaps the issue of collective memory, public memory, cultural memory, public history, and using one of these examples as a way of treating the problem. Then I am thinking about, I am teaching a graduate seminar. It's not an undergraduate seminar, but I am teaching a graduate seminar that I have been teaching for a while. Now it's more than 2 years that I don't teach it. And I am asking myself how I will proceed this time. And I think that is an interesting way to send the students to the field, to choose one of these markers that are there, or even a site where there is nothing. Because, for example, in Brazil, when I was then not in this book, but in Brazil, there are many sites associated with slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, and there is absolutely nothing there. Then how can we work those places where there is nothing? That is not about memory. It's about forgetting. Then I think that this could be a way, I would say, of teaching using the book. Because in all those places where at the end we have a memory that emerges, at some point there was nothing there. Then we needed a monument to be constructed. We need people to organize themselves. And we see on an almost weekly basis, then even students, then the high school students and so on, who are helping, for example, to preserve cemeteries, to organizing initiatives to have plaques indicating where cemeteries of African Americans or enslaved people were. Then when we have these markers, is the result of the work of all this work summed together that brings this to light.
Right. And as you were saying, as you were talking, I kind of was thinking about the other aspect that is sort of a sad reality, that we don't really have a museum, especially in the United States, that talks about the slave trade on its own. We have the African American Museum in DC, we have museums for African American history and culture, but we don't have anything that is just devoted to that that negative aspect of history.
Yeah, and this I would say that um, no other country then except for Liverpool and some community museums. Then there is a museum there in Brazil, then in a particular state that is Minas Gerais. It is called the
Mm-hmm.
Slaves Museum. It's a community museum that we have some. Than one here in Maryland, but these are private community museums that we do not
Mm-hmm.
have any visible museum
Right.
dedicated to slavery, and this was a choice.
Mm-hmm.
There is a new museum coming that will be inaugurated in Charleston.
Mm-hmm.
There, that was the first slave trading port in the United States. Then, in terms of importing enslaved people from, then a point of arrival of enslaved people from enslaved Africans, then who came from Africa, they would the largest. Then the point where the largest number disembarked was there. And they are doing an international African American museum
Mm-hmm.
that is going to tell about the history of slavery. They are at the place where then the slave trade was being conducted. But this was a choice that was made there. There was a choice that was made here in Washington, D.C., to not equate the experience of African Americans with slavery, which
Mm-hmm.
is, of course, a valuable and valid point. On the other hand, it seems to be clear when you are referring to other atrocities, such as the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have a the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and this is not a museum of Jewish history, even if you
Right.
have museums of Jewish history elsewhere. But this has been a choice because the idea is for many African Americans or Afro-Brazilians or then people of African descent elsewhere, they do not, the history of populations of African descent it starts before
Mm.
enslavement and slavery.
Right.
Then at the same time, it's something that erases the fact that these were parts of the history that helped it to create this country, and Brazil and Cuba and
Mm.
Portugal and so on.
Right. And it's kind of like the other aspect too. It's in part, it's understandable that the African American or Afro-Brazilian community doesn't want slavery or the slave trade to be the definer of their kind of
Mhm.
heritage. But at the same time, for the rest of us, it's oftentimes a good reminder that negative things, bad things happened in the past, and the museum to study it is a good place to avoid the repetition of it as well. So it, uh, I fully agree that it's sort of, I understand the African side of it, but there's the other aspect of learning from the past too, of not, like our students always like to say, let's not repeat the past. That's why we study history, and museums can help us with that.
Yeah, of course. And I think that um, perhaps the problem is that, and I think that is one, of course, central elements of the book, that all this debate about the slavery and the Atlantic slave trade and how people they are engaging with this past and with the monuments is not only associated to the past, but to the present of
Mhm.
racism, white supremacy, racial inequalities, depending on where you are, all this tied together. Then um, and this is why it becomes even more important, because how then slavery was and the Atlantic slave trade were uh, at at the heart, then were the founding elements to
Mhm.
the idea of race and racism, anti-Black racism, as we see today, but that emerged then in the at the end of the 15th century, when the Atlantic slave trade developed. Then this is an important element that should be told, and it's not something to be told to the populations of African descent, but to the white populations in countries like the United States who needed to know this, who needed to be confronted to this history. And it's something that you are going to see evolve the same ways that these monuments are being removed now, and that slavery is just entering the museum because it's very recent. We can expect that in a number of years there will be museums that will tell this story.
Definitely. And I think the other aspect to consider is the changing demographics, that as the white population, especially in the US, drops below 50% on its population share, museums will have to integrate these other narratives that people from Latin America, people from Africa want to see more about. And that, I mean, as much as we think of Europe as a very much white continent, it's changing as well. They will have to adjust to this kind of darker past of theirs as well.
Yeah, and we see all these because all these debates they are connected. And on the one hand, the how slavery is now in the museum, the debates regarding the monuments, and also all the collections of these museums that in many cases include a lot of objects, in many cases in perhaps then the big museums, either art museums or anthropology museums, that included then objects that were looted from the African continent or from Asia and Latin America, then during conquest or colonization. Then this is another element that is in debate right now. We saw this at the Brooklyn Museum, all these debates about the decolonize the museum, decolonize this place, and so on. Then this is certainly something that the museum is not, how can I say, an entity that is isolated from the societies where it is in. Then we can just hope and expect that these debates will become more and more heated and interesting to follow and to intervene as well.
Right. Now to close, I think when I looked at your CV, you were already working on 2 or 3 more projects. So what are your future plans?
My future plans. Then indeed I have a very short book, Routledge. They have a collection that is for short books related to museums. Then I just finished that. That is a tiny book like this that is on museums and Atlantic slavery. Then this I hope is going to be published then probably next year. Then this is done. Then it's a sort of offspring of this book, because the book doesn't deal with museums all over. And in this book, the tiny book, it includes a lot of then Brazil as well, that is not in the book Slavery in the Age of Memory. Now the other 2 projects, I have a book that is under contract with University of Chicago Press. There is a book about, and this is a history of slavery in the Americas, then the history of the Atlantic slavery in the Americas. That then it's a sort of survey that is intended then for larger audiences. But the 3 features of the book, on the one hand, is to include Africa in this history, because it's usually then is studied and not included in any of these books that focus on slavery in the Americas. Second, to include Brazil as a major player, because
Right.
usually then it's always the British Atlantic and the North Atlantic and the United States.
Yeah.
And third, also then women, enslaved women. Then this is a book that is a book for larger audiences. It draws already from much of the work that I already did, but I hope to make this a book that is accessible. And the other one is a more an academic monograph that deals, that I hope also to make this more accessible. That is under contract with Cambridge, with in this series with that Michael Gomez has on the history of African diaspora. And this is about the Atlantic slave trade on the Loango coast in West Central Africa, a place where the French, the Portuguese, the British, the Dutch were there. And I follow one particular object that was fabricated in France, given to a local ruler there, and then brought to Dahomey. At some point in the 19th century, we assume then it's a book that connects the history of slavery to the history of colonialism, and the focus is material culture.
Wow.
Then these
Wow.
are the two books that I am doing, which is, of course, is a challenge, but we are here for that.
Yeah, those two sound really fascinating, especially the one on the object. So that I'm going to look forward to see that in a few years.
Thank
Uh,
you. Thank you,
well,
Niels.
thank you for taking the time to talk about your new book. It
Thank you
was
for having
fascinating.
me. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure also to have the book being discussed in networks that are different from the ones that I am doing usually. Then I am engaging more and more with the history of the United States, and it's nice to see that my contribution in this specific field that is memory is welcome. And I hope you enjoy the book, those of you who have the opportunity of reading it.
I hope that a number of our subscribers will, because again, I think there's a lot of very good material and good material to think about the lost cause and how we perceive of memory in the Civil War era in there. So, well, again, thank you, and